Okay, so we're going to get started in our seminar today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Awabakal and Worimi people here in Newcastle on this campus, and we pay respect to elders past and present, and like to acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders, First Nations peoples joining us in the room or on Zoom today. So, as part of our Newcastle Youth Studies seminar series, we're very lucky here to have Sam Friedman from LSE in the UK, and he's going to talk about his work with Aaron Reeves on the award-winning book, Born to Rule. So Sam's going to talk for 40 minutes-ish, and then we'll spend the last 20 minutes-ish having some chat and getting some questions. For those online, please put your questions in the Q&A. We've had to kind of set up the seminar series with a bit more security these days, so I can't just enable the chat. There's stuff that goes on there, so please put it in the Q&A and I'll ask those questions to Sam when we're doing that at the end. So thanks again, Sam. Interested to hear what you have to say.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. Lovely to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm hoping this is at least sort of vaguely interesting and relevant to you guys as Australians, and really curious to hear, particularly if you think some of these issues resonate or have interesting crossovers with how you make sense of Australia and its upper echelons. I want to start actually though with a very British phrase, complete rubbish. Henry, a recently retired corporate lawyer, was visibly offended. For nearly 2 hours, he talked amiably about a highly successful career in the City of London. But now, fairly instantaneously, the atmosphere had changed. We just asked him a question that we put to nearly 150 people that we interviewed for this book. Do you consider yourself a member of the British elite? Frustration in his response, as you can see here, was palpable. But something felt a little incongruous about Henry's outrage. Maybe it's that we were sitting in the drawing room of his 7-bedroom townhouse in Bloomsbury. Maybe it was the fact that we knew his wealth extended beyond £10 million. Maybe it was the huge self-portrait of himself that hung opposite us as we talked. Or maybe it was something about Henry's background and life trajectory. He went to one of Britain's most elite schools. He attended Oxford. His father had held a very senior post in the civil service, as had his grandfather. And for more than 30 years, he had been a senior partner in a Magic Circle law firm. Or maybe it was just that as we spoke, and despite his protestations otherwise, it became abundantly clear that Henry was actually hugely influential. His personal networks included a governor of the Bank of England, a former chancellor, and he spoke of various times in his career when he'd levered his position to successfully lobby ministers. I should stress it wasn't that Henry was arrogant or pompous. On the contrary, he was positively charming and thoughtful throughout. But to us, at least, he seemed to be the embodiment of the British elite, both in origin and destination. And yet, clearly, and like the vast majority of people we spoke to for this project, this isn't how Henry saw himself. He rejected the idea that privilege had had any significant role in his success. He talked up his working class ancestors. He belittled his influence, as you can see. And more generally, he presented himself as a kind of exemplar of a more meritocratic era, both in the City of London and in Britain more generally. But what I want to try and argue to you today is that there's a kind of dangerous disconnect between how people like Henry see themselves and what we discern when we carefully analyse patterns of elite reproduction in Britain over the last 125 years. In many ways, I'm going to show you the British elite hasn't changed a lot. It continues to be a fairly socially exclusive formation. And this matters because it has implications for the elites that we get in Britain. I'll show you that not only do elites from more privileged backgrounds tend to tilt to the right, politically and culturally, but those leanings are accentuated if, like Henry, those people combine positional power with extreme wealth. So then why are elites like Henry so keen to convince us of their ordinariness? One answer I'm going to try and suggest to you is that recent rises in economic inequality, particularly the pulling away of those at the top, have made people like Henry insecure about their moral legitimacy, sensitive to public concern that they are perhaps unduly motivated by economic self-interest. In this context, then, public expressions of ordinariness, in the way you tell your backstory, in the way you express your cultural tastes, in the way you express your meritocratic legitimacy, we might say are a kind of logical strategy of impression management. Indeed, as I'll show you, British elites who successfully convince the public that they have risen from humble origins or have mainstream lifestyles are more likely to be viewed sympathetically, as more relatable, as more intelligent, as more hardworking, even to some extent as more competent. There is, in other words, I'm going to try and argue, a symbolic market for ordinariness in contemporary Britain. So there you go. That's the punchline of the book. I'll row back a bit now and tell you how I'm going to get to that conclusion. Specifically, what were the questions that motivated this long 7-year project? We basically set out to ask a fairly simple question. How has Britain's elite changed over the last 125 years? I suppose more specifically, we were interested in whether it's changed demographically. We were wanting to sort of interrogate this caricature of wealthy public schoolboys and its connection to Britain's elite. We also wanted to ask, is it marked by the same culture? And does it think and behave in a particular way? Is there kind of ideological coherence? But of course, the starting point for a project like this is always got to be this thorny question of what are we actually talking about when we deploy a term like elite. Popular interest, I think, in Australia as well as in the UK in the topic of elites, particularly on our television screens, has probably never been higher. But as John Scott mentions over 20 years ago now, this is, I think, often flanked by this kind of maddening conceptual fuzziness. We hear, for example, constantly on the right of a kind of liberal metropolitan elite. We hear on the left about an establishment. We're rarely told where those formations actually start and finish. And social scientific definitions are often similarly broad. This is perhaps the most regularly cited definition. It comes from Seamus Khan. He says, elites are those with disproportionate access to and control over a range of economic, social, cultural, and political resources. At once, I think, entirely reasonable, but it's also kind of unhelpfully inclusive. Certainly it means, and I would put myself in this guilty category, that it's allowed researchers to operationalize often very broad thresholds of eliteness, often including up to sort of 10, 20% of national populations. And while we're at it, aren't I elite? Isn't this whole book a bit rich coming from 2 white male professors at one of Britain's most elite universities? Yes, clearly, no doubt that's true, and happy to talk about in questions the ways in which actually our positions acted as exactly the kind of elite signal that probably opened a lot of doors for us in this project. I think there'll always be challenges in identifying where the boundary sits between elite and non-elite. But what we wanted to do here was kind of work with a conceptually coherent definition, in particular, kind of preserve an appropriate order of magnitude. What we did is turn to this book. This is Who's Who. It's the kind of leading biographical dictionary of what they call noteworthy and influential people in the UK. It's been published every year since 1897. And throughout that period, it's consistently represented a tiny slice, about 0.05% of the UK population. Today, that means about 34,000 people. And our argument is that it's actually quite coherent conceptually in the sense that it's really trying to document an elite based on position. This is the idea associated with the Italian scholar Mosca, who argued that elites are empowered through their ability to control or exert authority over others and usually occupy top positions in organizational hierarchy. So actually in that way, about 50% of the people in Who's Who are actually included automatically. So if you are an MP, if you are a judge, if you're an ambassador, if you are a university vice chancellor, if you're a FTSE 100 CEO, if you're a national newspaper editor, poet laureate, fellow of the British Academy, you are included by virtue of your office. The other 50% are also positional elites, but they're selected based on reputation. So there's a kind of slightly shadowy board that select people based on this idea that they've had sustained impact over time. But for many, Who's Who may still feel like a rather large group to constitute a national elite. So if we go back to that Khan definition, interestingly, he's talking about people who have disproportionate access and control over a range of resources. The implication there is that these different forms of power often interact. they accentuate one another. Many of the people in Who's Who, you might say, are only influential in one domain. That's how they got in. So we wanted to go a little bit further and identify those who I sort of wield perhaps particular power within the elite. Here we were drawing on sort of classic elite theories, Marx, Pareto, Mills, and we sought to identify those who have disproportionate control over both positional and economic power. So we define what we call in the book the British wealth elite as those who are positionally elite in the sense that they're in Who's Who, and economically in the sense that they fall in the top 1% of the wealth distribution. So that takes us down to about 0.01%. About 6,000 people are in that group. How do we identify them? Two ways. So historically, we're analysing probate records in the UK. So that's the public record of people's wealth at death. And we then match those people to Who's Who. So Aaron spent many months looking through millions of probate records to do that. To identify today's elite, wealth elite, we turned to a survey that we sent to everybody in the current version of Who's Who, where we asked them lots of questions I'll talk about in a sec, but one of those was about their total wealth. So those are the groups we're working with. How are we analysing that? So this was a very ambitious, perhaps too ambitious project, longitudinal and mixed methods. So on the quantitative side, we have the entire database of Who's Who, so that's about 125,000 people over the last century or so. We have probate records. We have this survey that I mentioned, which allowed us to ask a whole range of interesting kind of attitudinal questions of elites. More on that later. We also did some experiments with elites through the survey. We're also combining that with longitudinal qualitative. So we have 217 interviews in all, with entrants in Who's Who organised into 4 birth cohorts across the 20th century. Obviously, lots of those people are dead. So the early sort of ones born in the first half of the 20th century, we turned to something called the British Library's National Life Stories series, which we then matched to Who's Who. And then for the later cohorts, we ourselves carried out 150 of those. So let me start with this issue of elite identity, this sort of struggle to be ordinary that I mentioned with Henry at the start. So this sort of finding came out in a number of ways in the data. The first was fairly straightforward, right? We asked these questions. Do you see yourself as part of the elite? At the end of interviews, as you can imagine. The vast majority strongly push back on this, often quite offended by this idea. You might say that's fairly understandable, right? I don't know about Australia, but certainly in the UK, when the word elite comes up, right, it's a pejorative term. So it's perhaps not a surprise that people push back on that. But it also came out in other indirect ways. One, for example, was through these kind of narratives of opening up, of progression. So a lot of people were telling us the elite world that they're part of, okay, yeah, used to be elite, used to be quite exclusive, but things have changed, right? Not necessarily in the last 20 or 30 years, but often pitched their sort of comparison to, as Duncan does here, you know, the middle part of the 20th century, saying, you know, basically, you know, things have opened up. I am part of a new meritocratic world. That's how I've got to where I've got to. In this case, he's talking about the power of kind of elite private schools changing over time. Another way that claims to ordinariness played out was via what I would describe as fairly tortured discussions with people about their class backgrounds. So this was particularly the case among those from fairly unambiguously elite origins. This is Victoria. She was actually a professor from a sort of vaguely aristocratic family, actually. And you can see, if you read this quote, sort of how uncomfortable the topic of class is for her. You know, and answers were quite like this in general, kind of stilted rather than direct, elaborate but vague. And what was interesting was that when we turned to the survey, where we asked people their subjective class background, but we also asked various kind of objective questions about, for example, what their parents did for a living, we found that actually 43% of these elites who told us they were from working class backgrounds had actually had parents who were in solidly kind of middle class jobs, right? And like Victoria, the other one, I mean, not this one, many interviewees seem to kind of attempt to deflect from or downplay aspects of their upbringing that might signal eliteness. So, you know, sometimes that was via comparison with perhaps more advantaged people they'd been to school with. or often it was about kind of presenting their own origin story, not through their own background, their own upbringing, but through a kind of extended family history, talking about grandparents or great-grandparents, in order to tell a kind of story of upward mobility, a story of meritocratic striving. So there was this sense that instinctively, it seemed to me, people wanted to tell an upward story, right? They wanted to sort of claim a meritocratic legitimacy for their eliteness. And what was interesting about that is it was really different to the narratives of elites born at the start of the 20th century. Okay, so what you saw in these interviews, which were not anonymized because they're publicly available, this was Jeremy Morse, University Chancellor, was often this quite proud, sort of open parading of an upper class identity. In this case, sort of quite happily, breezily talking about the inherited wealth that had flanked his career and helped him get to where he got to. There was this general sense that almost people were luxuriating in the sense of their own sort of economic and cultural distinction. But so why do we care about this sort of recent turn towards ordinariness among elite people? Well, I think the primary reason for us was that it seemed to directly contradict what we were seeing when we were looking quantitatively at these people's lives. So I'm going to try and take you through that in a number of ways. First of all, we wanted to interrogate this claim among contemporary elites that they were a part of a kind of more meritocratic elite. So to get at this, we wanted to look at the power of coming from a very elite background in terms of getting to these positions in the first place. So to do that, what we did was track down the wealth at death of the people's parents in Who's Who, to then look at the proportion of people in Who's Who were born into the top 1% or top 10% of the wealth distribution. So this basically shows you two things. Firstly, that a disproportionate number of people in elite positions come from wealthy backgrounds, probably not a big surprise. But actually, the more important thing to sort of focus on here is the trend. And this is basically showing you that, contra to those elite narratives, the relationship between wealth and elite recruitment has stayed actually fairly stable over the 20th century. And that's remarkable because actually there's been huge declines. This is not our data, it comes from Alvarado and colleagues. Huge declines in the share of the overall wealth distribution taken by the top 1% in Britain over that same period. So what's interesting is that despite people coming from wealthy backgrounds their families being comparatively less rich than they were in the past, the ability to propel their offspring into those top positions has stayed remarkably consistent. So if you are born in the top 1% of the wealth distribution in the UK, you've been about 20 times more likely to reach elite positions than anyone else born in your cohort across this period. So elite origins matter. What about very elite private schools? There's lots of different tiers of elite schooling in the UK, but you've perhaps heard of some of these. They're called the Clarendon schools. There are 9 sort of most elite schools. They are very expensive. They're very old. They have very silly dress codes, as you can see from Eton up there. Lots written, lots talked about their power or their hold on the British elite. We wanted to actually look at this. And actually, there is a notable decline story here. So this is just the proportion of people in Who's Who who've been to different types of schools. The bottom are the Clarendon schools. That's the trend line over time. HMC schools are about 2% of all students. They're a kind of second tier of elite schools, about 200 schools in that group. And then you've got all independent schools who together make up about 7% of people going to secondary school. So it's a very elite figure, but you can see that, they are educating the majority of elites in the UK, but actually the Clarendon schools go down over time, right? They used to educate 1 in 5. They now educate roughly about 1 in 10 elites. That decline is noteworthy. We write about it in depth in terms of what's driving it in the book, but I don't want to overstate it, right? These schools remain extraordinarily successful, even today, if you have a child in one of those schools. they're about 50 times more likely to reach an elite position than anyone else. That's ludicrous in terms of any semblance that it's connected to educational attainment. Yes, these schools do well, but there are other schools that do equally well that have nowhere near these rates of elite recruitment. I also wanted just to show some work we did on elite girls' schools. We kind of wanted to ask whether there's an old girls network in the UK. We've sort of constructed a group that are similar in terms of propulsive power. But what's interesting, you can see in this graph, is that across time, those elite girls' schools have never been as powerful for elite women than elite boys' schools have been for men in terms of getting into elite positions. And there's an interesting gendered story about, I think, the sort of role of elite schooling and the slight ambivalence that's often been there about what those schools are creating in terms of elite women, which I can talk about if you're interested in questions. Finally, we wanted to look at Oxbridge, Oxford and Cambridge, perhaps our most well-known avenue or channel of elite recruitment. So the basic sort of trend here, this is at the bottom, you can see sort of our elite. I think you have a group of 8 or something that's like our Russell group, it's more like 20 or so. That blue line there is Oxbridge. You can see over time it's been fairly stable in its power, but you can also see that, you know, the amount of graduates has gone up hugely over time in the elite, but also obviously in the population as a whole. So if you actually look at this, you know, at the start of the period we're looking at, about 50% of all students go to Oxford or Cambridge. Now they make up 1% of all university graduates. So if you look at actually what are the relative odds of reaching an elite position if you've gone through Oxbridge, you see a different story. You see one that's actually quite an interesting story of change. So at the start of the period we're looking at, Oxbridge is literally a sort of gateway, you know, and the narratives are ridiculous. The nepotistic narratives of like you walk into a job in, you know, elite sectors from an Oxbridge college. You then see actually quite a powerful decline story in the power of an Oxbridge degree. And then I think interestingly, ever since kind of people born at the end of the Second World War, you see an Oxbridge degree is becoming more and more powerful again. So I want to just stress that, you know, there's not been no demographic change at all in the British elite over time. Certainly in terms of gender, there is a pretty interesting, pretty powerful opening up story, particularly since the mid-1980s. This is year of entry to who's who. You can see from a very low base, which I think is worth noticing straight away. But you can see there's been quite a rapid increase now. About 1 in 3 of all entrants are women. But as I mentioned, you know, that's notable in terms of the fact that it's largely white women. I think it's also worth saying women are clearly still underrepresented. And actually our interviews, and we wrote a whole chapter on this, with elite women sort of underline the misogyny and discrimination that most of them reached in actually getting to those positions in the first place. On ethnicity, you also see a kind of somewhat increasing story of diversity, particularly for Asian British elites, but the basic story is that the British elite has and continues to be overwhelmingly white. So this sort of story of persistent reproduction brings me back to that topic of ordinariness that I started with. So if elite narratives of opening up that they're telling us is a bit of an illusion, why are they so keen to present themselves as ordinary? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, our claim is that there's a kind of market for ordinariness, right? And to explain this, I want to turn to the issue of elite culture, elite lifestyle. One of the really nice things about Who's Who is that people don't just say their schooling, they don't just say where they went to university. They have, ever since the book's been published, put their recreations into their entry. So you've got this wonderful window into changes in elite culture in Britain over time. But also, this is a public document. And journalists often are searching it to find out tidbits of information about influential people. So this is actually very much a public performance of your cultural self, how you want others to see you culturally. So we analysed this, we've written a whole paper about it. Oh, sorry, yeah. So there were some interesting changes over time. I'm just going to sort of restrict it to a very simple kind of analysis here. What we could see really is that, you know, at the start of the period we're looking at here, there's a sort of dominance of kind of aristocratic cultures, sort of hunting and shooting. But what you can see here is that through the 20th century, you get this kind of rise of highbrow culture. So classical music, opera, theatre, ballet. But then sort of from the mid 20th century onwards, that starts to decline, and you start to see this interesting trend of elites telling us that what really animates them is spending time with their family, their pets. They start mentioning things like football. And so you sort of see this interesting sort of move towards a kind of ordinary cultural self-presentation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are abandoning a kind of distinction. So we actually, you know, people often put a whole range of different things in their entry. So when we were looking at actually what's the combinations that people are putting culturally, you see often the most powerful mode, that red line today, is actually a kind of melding. So you're sort of putting both a popular, perhaps you talk about, oh, I like, you know, a second tier football team, but I also quite like opera or something like that. And what was really interesting to us, we talked about this with some colleagues earlier, was that when we went into the anonymized interviews, we would take the who's who profile with us and see how the kind of cultural self that the person communicated in an anonymized interview dovetailed with the public performance of their cultural self that they would tell us in an interview. And actually, you know, this is just one example, but there was this really intriguing sort of disconnect in the way people kind of constructed themselves. So this is someone that we've sort of suitably anonymized, but you can see this distance between this kind of very kind of knowing, ordinary self-presentation in the who's who profile, and then, you know, essentially being quite candid about being unashamedly highbrow in their interview. So this left us with two questions, really. Why are people doing this? Why are they sort of, what's the value? And why might this ordinariness have kind of increased in recent decades? So our answer to the first question, as I mentioned, is that there's this kind of currency to ordinariness for these people, right? They are in positions of public prominence. And to get at that, we conducted a series of experiments. Quite simple, nationally representative sample, about 500 people with each experiment. And what we did was we gave people imaginary vignettes of elites. We did it for judges, we did it for CEOs. In this case, I'm showing you one with academics. And essentially people were just given either vignette 1 or vignette 2. And the only thing that we change is their class background here in these imaginary elites. And then we just asked them to rate that imaginary elite in various ways. And the sort of results were really quite marked. As you can see here, when you ask about, you know, do you think that this person is intelligent? Do you think they're hardworking? Do you think their research is useful? Do you think they are likely to listen to somebody like me? You see that people are much more sympathetic to the academic from a working class background, rating them higher in all these ways. And it was the same for CEOs, for judges. In other words, elites who successfully convince ordinary people that they come from more humble backgrounds, by this evidence anyway, are more likely to be viewed as more meritorious. So downplaying privilege then, as I mentioned at the start, isn't just this sort of British discomfort around issues of class. It might be this actual quite effective strategy of impression management. That doesn't, though, necessarily explain why it may have got more powerful in recent years. So our argument, as you might remember from the start, is that this is sort of linked to recent rises in economic inequality, particularly the pulling away of those at the top. The basic idea here is that, you know, as people pull away economically, they become sort of insecure about their moral legitimacy in the eyes of publics that they are accountable to. So, you know, think about your VC at Newcastle University, right? As their salary is getting bigger the sense that they are sort of insecure about how the people that they are accountable to, staff and students, might sort of become heightened.
We wish that was the case.
So this is a very big claim, and it's very hard to test. And I should say these are very tentative findings. We're telling a big story here, so take all of this with a pinch of salt, and very happy for you to push back. But here we actually did an experiment, not with normal people, but with the elites themselves. So basically, we asked them to imagine they were appearing on a popular BBC radio show called Desert Island Discs. You've probably not heard of this, but the basic idea is influential people are invited on to radio to talk about music that they would take to a desert island, or a book that they would take to a desert island if they were stranded there. We asked these people to imagine they were doing that, but actually for half of them, they also got this question, which was framed as a question, but was actually a primer to get them to think about inequality and their potential place in the sort of rising inequality, with the idea of, will that have an impact on the way they express their cultural preferences? And it did. Statistically, significantly, when inequality was made salient, elites became less likely to tell us that they would take a piece of classical music, for example. They would be less likely to take a serious sort of highbrow book. And they also changed the way they talk. So we asked them sort of, why would you take that piece of music? Why would you take that book? And people were less likely to kind of give an aesthetic reason, more likely to give a kind of nostalgic reason. Oh, I'm taking that because, you know, that was the music that I heard when I first met my husband or something. In other words, right, again, tentatively, when elites are reminded that they are the beneficiaries of rising inequality, they seem to ramp up efforts to present themselves as ordinary. Okay, final issue I want to touch on, which you perhaps have been thinking throughout, which is who cares? Elites project ordinariness while remaining closed. Okay, but why does that persisting elite reproduction actually matter? Well, actually in sociology, this is a really big question for people interested in elites. There's been a long-standing sort of hypothesis that when our elites are drawn from very narrow social channels, they are more likely to sort of think and act in certain ways, right? There's a kind of group think that has implications for power, has implications for politics. So we wanted to examine that in the last part of the book by drawing on these questions that I mentioned we had in the survey about people's policy preferences and political orientations. And this has got some salience in the UK because our recent cabinet, you can see here, Labour cabinet, was the most sort of working class in origin. And so there was a lot of, I think, slightly disappointed now, sort of left-leaning people that felt that this might have an impact on the direction of the country. Interestingly, at least attitudinally, we can see that it does in terms of the British elite. So elites drawn from working class backgrounds are more likely to tilt to the left versus colleagues from more privileged backgrounds. As you can see from this graph, they're more likely to believe, less likely to believe economic growth should be one of the government's top priorities, more likely to believe government should increase taxes on health, education, social security, more likely to believe the government should increase taxes on the rich. Also more left-wing on issues of race and empire. Significantly, women in the elite are also very significantly on the left. And this is also where I think this sort of wealth elite that I mentioned at the start becomes really interesting in terms of focus, because you can also see that that group are significantly tilt to the right politically. And, you know, that's significant, I think, because both theoretically and reflecting on some of the interviews, you know, those people have an outsized ability to use their wealth to channel their own political preferences into action. And so what we often were hearing were people who were positionally very powerful, but had become very wealthy either from their work or from other avenues, and therefore had been able to kind of retire early, take up a range of different board roles that were unpaid philanthropic roles. and as a result, kind of sort of further their own political projects. So I think, you know, you can see that there's a kind of elite reproduction matters to some extent because it seems to, at least attitudinally, not necessarily in terms of action, but attitudinally map onto politics. I'm running out of time. Lots of, well, huge amount of limitations. We're trying to tell a big story here. There's all sorts of issues with our analysis. Some of them are there, but you, I'm sure, have thought of many as well. Just to conclude, I think the basic message that we are getting from this research is the contemporary British elite increasingly kind of presents itself as ordinary. And it does so by kind of setting itself against the kind of caricatured notion of a closed, stuffy, early 20th century elite. This, we argue, performs an important signaling function because, as far as we can see, the public are more sympathetic to elites who they see as more humble and down to earth. Now, of course, they have to believe the performance of ordinariness and should just say, this is a good example. Rishi Sunak desperately tried to do ordinariness and failed, right? This is, he was well known for padding around Downing Street in these white Adidas trainers as a kind of marker that he was an ordinary guy, but this didn't work for him. So the caveat, of course, is that people don't always believe the ordinaries, but when they do, we can see they are more sympathetic. This process, though, is pernicious for us because it strongly contradicts the empirical reality. Despite what elites might think about change, despite what they might use their outsized channels of communication to tell us all about change, the reality is the sort of stereotypes that you can see here. This is the famous Bullingdon Club photo with David Cameron and Boris Johnson on it. You know, this sort of portrait of how elites are made in Britain still largely holds, I think. And shining a light on that is important, I think, not just because it shows the entrenched inequalities in who gets to elite positions, but I think we have tentative evidence that it's implicated in the type of politics we get. This is perhaps our best known sort of example of the currency of ordinariness. Nigel Farage, our Pauline Hanson, who, you know, is from a very privileged background, but sells himself as a pint swilling ordinary guy. So to return to the start then, the argument is that when people like Henry or Nigel perform ordinariness, when they downplay their power, when they deflect their privilege, they are intentionally or not obscuring, I think, the very real differences in wealth and power, opportunity and influence that continue to separate themselves from everyone else. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sam. That was great. So we'll now take some questions and have a discussion. I might take one from the room to begin with, and then I can move online. Has anyone here got something to ask? I think I've got one on. But yeah, I think this is going to work. Yep.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Sam. That was and thanks for leaving us with Farage.
Apologies
to look at. On Nigel Farage, and actually, this is a question that Mitch who's not here, was talking about last week, who was telling me that Rupert Lowe is also becoming increasingly influential without me really realizing it. Is there something distinct about, or at least what strikes me as distinct about Farage and Boris Johnson, was that they don't try and mask their elites, or particularly Boris. They don't try and mask their elite upbringing in the same way.
Yeah.
And there's more of a sense of a shared dislike for the middle classes, you know, a bond between the aristocracy and the working classes against the middle classes. And it certainly strikes me most about Boris, that there was no sense that he was trying to cover everything. There was more authenticity through honesty about, this is who I am, and that's what connects me. And is there a kind of, a form of politics emerging around?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that so I think politics is weird, and I've not helped my case by giving you loads of images of politicians. Politicians, I think, are distinct in a number of ways. They have a particular need for sort of popularity that's linked to electoral outcomes that make them distinct, I think, in their sort of projects, public projects. And I think what you see in British politics is, I think, as well as largely, I would say, probably a sort of a form of ordinariness that goes under the radar. We see these weird sort of throwbacks to the old sort of upper class through people like Boris Johnson and Rupert Lowe, and no, I'm thinking about the lounging, Rees-Mogg, yes, who are like their currency is almost the opposite. They're sort of playing into this sort of bizarre oldie worldy sort of version of the British upper class, and sort of getting away with it through, I think, playing into some sort of nostalgia that we have for that. But I think they're fairly rare if you actually really look at the swathe of British politics. And, you know, one of the things my colleague Aaron is doing at the moment is he's going through all the Reform UK, which is, I don't know what the equivalent party is, but One Nation, and seeing how many of them actually come from really quite privileged backgrounds, even though the whole project is a kind of ordinariness project. I think maybe there's something about pushing back on a particular kind of liberal metropolitan political values. So the culture war, some of the culture war issues there. But I think in large part, what we're sort of keying into here is a kind of people who are actually largely not politicians. These are people who are top of large hierarchies and who need to some extent the buy-in of publics. And so being able to project a certain image of having got there meritocratically and being an ordinary sort of regular person has this kind of currency for them more broadly. Yeah.
Okay, we've got some questions online. They kind of few relate to the idea of ordinariness.
Yes.
I mean, I was going to say at least our kind of political racist grifters in Australia are kind of actually working class, unlike yours. Like Pauline, for instance. But like relating to that ordinary thing.
Yeah.
Like I wonder if ordinary is felt differently in Australia or across different contexts, maybe. And in relation, did you find anything interesting about the relative success and failures of the elite attempting to perform ordinariness? Because you can sense the grift, right?
Yeah.
Are there consequences for failure in these performances, or does wealth act to insulate them, or can they just go back to the opera?
Yeah, great. Thank you for asking it. So we have a paper that's about to come out in sociology, which is our follow-up to this, which exactly tries to get at this, because I think the question that we were getting is like, yeah, come on, like those experiments are selecting on the notion that people believe the performance. But of course, we are all discerning this about people in positions of power all the time. What we wanted to do was then give people different scenarios where there's a performance of ordinariness, but then they subsequently find out complicating information. We had 3 different scenarios of complicating information. So you find out something from another party that sort of contradicts what the elite has said about themselves. And another one was that you overhear the elite person being explicitly duplicitous. And what's slightly depressing, and there was one other which I can't remember, but the basic takeaway from the analysis is that people still seem to uprate elites who attempt ordinariness, even if they find out information that complicates. Maybe they find out, for example, that, one of their parents was middle class, even though they tell that they say they're from a working class background. People tend to seem to give elites the benefit of the doubt, unless they're being explicitly duplicitous. So the scenario we had was that an elite judge says he's a season ticket holder at a sort of lower league football team, and then you overhear him saying that to a colleague that they only do that to sort of like seem relatable to the office staff in their chambers. And there people massively downrate, right? Because it's explicit duplicity. But I think the slightly sort of, slightly sort of interesting or depressing, however you look at it, is that people seem generally to sort of give the ordinariness performance the benefit of the doubt. It's almost like people care as much about the performance as the reality, which is maybe some of the like Nigel Farage thing. So, you know, it's not, he doesn't hide that he went to one of the top private schools, but people maybe don't read it. And so then the information doesn't seem to like stick in a contradictory way for them.
Have another question here from Sam Whiting. Why do you think the Labor cabinet has ended up reproducing these narratives rather than challenging them, given their class backgrounds? What do you think the role of institutions play in reproducing a ruling class? That is, does the institution of public office have its own agency?
Yeah, so thank you for asking this. So we devote quite a lot of time to this question in the book, because obviously we're talking about attitudes, we're not talking about action, and there are all sorts of ways in which people's attitudes don't map onto their action, and largely because often of institutional constraints. I think the basic point is that if you are in a position of power, you are often corresponding with all sorts of other elites that are probably continue to be fairly, as we've shown you, fairly demographically coherent. So if you are in that cabinet, your top civil servants are still likely to come from very privileged backgrounds. You're getting all sorts of cross-cutting pressures from the business realm, where people are probably still coming from these sorts of backgrounds. So the notion that you are sort of able to just take your attitudes and put them into practice, I think is complicated by that. I think in the relation to the Labour cabinet, it's also just a political orientation. I mean, I think those Starmer is, you know, sold a story to the country, and particularly to the Labour Party, that he was much more left-wing than he actually is. And I think that's the reality. I don't think it's so much, sometimes it's ideological, right? And we're not saying here that working class background equals radical left politics. That's ludicrous. We can see just an association with background and a left tilt, which is interesting. But of course, it's always going to be mediated by, you know, other factors that influence your ideology.
Yeah. Jane Kenway has a question. Your analysis does not address issues associated with transnational elites. Neither does it mention overseas students in elite schools.
Yeah.
How might your ordinariness thesis speak to both of these things?
Yeah, thank you so much. So the transnational question, I think sort of there's, so I was talking to Roger Burrows about this, and, you know, he's done some interesting work on transnational elites. I mean, it comes back to the question of who the elite are that you're interested in. It's worth just reiterating who we're looking at here. We're looking at people who have attained positions of outsized influence in largely British professional fields and institutions. And those people remain, our analysis shows, overwhelmingly like British born. And so you go to central London, you'll see a whole realm of transnational elite people, usually who are working in a kind of transnational business realm, who are not in Who's Who, don't want to be in Who's Who, and of which our analysis is probably completely irrelevant to. And I don't think those people are doing ordinariness, because they've got absolutely no reason to do ordinariness. They're not accountable to publics quite in the same way. And so, you know, I think if you go and observe the lifestyles of people living in places like Mayfair, you're not going to see a lot of ordinariness going on there. So it's partly a question of who is the elite you're looking at. And, you know, we're not saying we have a complete monopoly on different versions of elites. The international schools question is also fascinating. There's a couple of scholars that have done interesting work on this. Per Ailing in the UK has looked at Nigerian elites sending, you know, their children to very top British private schools. And I think there, what's fascinating is often the sort of project that they are trying to sort of inculcate is very different to ordinariness. It's almost sort of trying to derive a kind of secondary embodied cultural capital that corresponds to a certain kind of English nurse, English gentleman sort of habitus that as her analysis shows, often then is used as a ticket to go back to Nigeria and has currency in those contexts. So I think probably the question of what international students are getting from British public schools is maybe quite different in its sort of character to the ordinariness that we're seeing here. And it's another empirical question, as she says, it's a gap in what we're doing here.
Yeah. So essentially you're looking at the more British establishment itself, not rather the people that are coming to kind of, I suppose, gain various forms of symbolic capital from being associated with it or going through those similar processes.
Yeah, we're selecting on the destinations, and we're not seeing all of the people in the pool in those schools, for example. We're just looking at the likelihood of reaching these positions if you've been to those schools. And, you know, there will be plenty of people in that question who come from often other parts of the empire and then stay in the UK and reach these positions, in which case I would imagine that they probably have to adapt some of their strategies to fit what's acceptable in the UK, which might be this ordinariness. But if they're going back and using that symbolic capital in Australia, you know, Rhodes scholars coming to Oxford and then coming back, you know, what they are sort of deriving and communicating from that education, it might look quite different than what we're talking about here.
Libyans going to the LSE.
Yeah. Oh God, don't get me started on that.
A question: is there a temporality? When did the ordinariness start coming in? Sorry if I missed it on the graph.
Yeah,
I kind of associate it with like the Blairite embracement of Britpop, right?
Yeah.
Like, is that the point where this really becomes central?
Yeah.
I mean, because at the time, I suppose in the 90s too, that's where a lot of cultural scholarship kind of starts to look at omnivores and like the increasing, the less distinction between high and low culture and all that kind of stuff. Is there a kind of crossover here with broader cultural consumption in terms of what's going on in terms of what the elite are performing?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, so with our ordinariness, there's two strands. One is the cultural self-presentation, and one is the like narration of background. Our argument, which is tentative, is that it's linked to trends in inequality, the pulling away of those at the top, which has been broadly happening since the late 90s in the UK, about 30 years.
Yep.
And so the argument is, conceptually, we think when that happens, there's a sort of reason why people then need to start articulating ordinariness, because there's this sense that they might be getting this extra moral scrutiny of like, why are you suddenly so much richer and you're potentially more and more distant from us, and you know, you rely on our support for your legitimacy, so you will ramp up efforts. And so, yeah, I mean, it does dovetail with the Britpop era. And I think you do see, I mean, that was one of the reasons why we had Blair up there, because he was fantastic at it. But I think, yeah, of course, culturally, there are other shifts all the way from the 60s onwards, I think, when you think of a sort of decline of deference in the UK and all sorts of kind of cultural movements that like challenged highbrow culture and brought popular, like legitimate popular culture into the domain. But our argument here, which, as I said, is tentative, is that it's linked to the rise of inequality at the top end. Yep.
Hey, love that opening quote, of course. I'm interested, and it's kind of a tricky question for sociologists because we always want to trust what people tell us, right? But like in this reporting of the amount of power people say they have and how much it is, you think it's actually performative currency or not, like, because I can see definitely in my interviews with fossil fuel execs, they say things like the environment movement has so much power and we have no power at all. And honestly, when I'm in the room with them, I feel like they kind of believe it.
Yeah.
But we also know, like, national surveys, people constantly underreport their class origins. And so is there an extent to which, I guess, it's internalized, or I don't know how we ever measure that as sociologists, but I'm interested if you have any idea about that.
No, thank you. Again, this is like a central issue, this issue of intentionality. Like, is the ordinariness a strategy that's like sort of an attempt to pull the wool over the eyes of the public? Or is it just, as you say, something that's internalized? My answer, I think, having thought about this a lot, is I don't know. There is some evidence, like the cultural duplicity that I showed you, where it was kind of obvious, right? I mean, I've got your who's who profile, and the person is completely different to the version that they've obviously quite carefully thought about, that they want to go out and be in the public domain. When it comes to background, I think it's more the latter, actually. I think people genuinely believe it. And I think that it's partly that people live in bubbles and they have this relative sense of, you know, who's in my structural neighborhood. There's people that are more privileged than me. I don't get out much past it. So maybe I'm not that powerful. But I think there's also this sense in which our culture, and maybe it's the same in Australia, fetishizes meritocracy to such an extent that we, whether we know it or not, we just instinctively reach for a version of our own story that helps us both feel and communicate a sense of our meritocratic legitimacy. And I think that's partly what's happening in these wanting to tell an upward story and finding a way to like look into your family history, or just sort of imbibe a version of your origin that helps you tell that story. Yeah.
Excellent. We're running out of time now, so I think we'll hold it there. So thanks a lot for your time, Sam, and we'll hold it there. Thanks.
Thank you.